So the upper levels of the Qing dynasty, the Qing ruling class, are going to really try and focus back on the traditional motives. They're going to say, okay, we let our tradition slip. We let our exclusion slip. So now we just have to be more firm, and eventually we'll be able to expel the barbarians again. And this really just demonstrates how much they are losing touch with China as a whole. During this period after the unequal treaties, you're going to see a long series of renewed rebellions. These are very common in China's history. You have groups of individuals who feel disenfranchised, and they are going to try and break away and attack the ruling class. And yet, these rebellions don't really make too much headway in terms of toppling the Qing because there's such split support. And because now you have this Western influence and the Western powers are going to do whatever possible they need to keep the Qing in power. Because having the Qing stay in power is going to make their occupation much easier. So you have rebellions like the Taiping Rebellion from 1850 to 1860. And when I say this isn't a big deal, and this is even though it's going to involve millions of people, although it takes a decade, although it certainly chips away at the Qing dynasty, it's not going to accomplish its goal of removing Western influence. The Taiping Rebellion is led by Hung Xiuquan, who is a Chinese schoolteacher. And he's looking specifically towards the destruction of the Qing, who he views rightfully as non Chinese, because remember they are Manchu, they're Manchurians, and a reordering of society. So it's actually going to also be getting rid of an enormous amount of many of the local Chinese traditions, such as foot binding, female infanticide, and quite a bit of the land rules, the landlord system, the peasant system, trying to look for a more equitable society. Now, while Hong Xichuan does witness enormous gains throughout China, and though he does get close to toppling the Qing, he is still going to be put down, not just by the Chinese themselves, those who are still loyal to the emperor and to the benefits they receive, but also by the Western powers, because again, the Qing helps really cement their occupation. During the Restoration period, China, at least a younger generation of the ruling class, are going to see, all right, we've had to accept these Western treaties, and yet we need to modernize too, because we don't like the treaties and we do want to get rid of them. But something in terms of the Taiping Rebellion, that's a little bit too strong of a resistance movement that many of the upper classes want to see. It's too different. They don't want to upend Chinese society too much. The Restoration period really isn't uniform, and many members of the Qing administration are reluctant to make the change. There's again that push for the traditional values in agriculture and frugality rather than to attempt to match westernization. So then you have something like the self strengthening movement, which is supposed to be seen as a compromise. You're still going to be keeping that Eastern Chinese mindset, and yet you're also trying to include Western technology. So it's a little bit like trying to put a band aid on top of a stab wound. You're trying to put sort of a topical covering on something where the problems that are innate to the system are far deeper, far more serious. There's enormous difficulties in trying to reconcile these changes, along with a very ineffective bureaucracy. And Western companies, Western investment is really going to edge out any attempts of Chinese investment. So it's going to be very unlike the situation the Japanese had, where they were able to produce their own industry, where they were able to produce these Saibutsu class, these financial cliques, their own financial system, their own administration to take over their technology. So they're going to, so these reforms aren't going to be effective. And it's going to really sink home when Japan declares war against China. and the Sino-Japanese War. Now, the Western powers are going to oversee the treaty process because they don't want to see Japan gain any more territory than they already have. And the Sino-Japanese War is really an indication of how far Japan has come along in terms of industrialization and in terms of adopting Western attitudes. So their focus is now going to be towards empire, but empire in the South Pacific. So after the Sino-Japanese War, there's an awareness among the younger members that China needs to rip off this bandage and really needs to delve more into the problems inherent into the system. And this is known as the 100 Days Reform. This is spurred by Chinese reformers who have gained the ear of Emperor Guangxu, that the West and Japan are now intent on dividing China into spheres of influence. And so these old reforms that were given official sanction but never really truly implemented, Guangxu is certainly encouraged now that he is going to enforce these, that he is going to do his best to try and bring China back up. The problem is that although he is certainly emperor in name, he is not emperor in power. The one who really controls power in Qing Palace is that of his aunt, Empress Dowager Cixi, and the corresponding not concubine class, I'm sorry, eunuch class. So basically those reforms are put to an immediate end, and Guangxu is actually going to be put in under house arrest. Now, Cixi does not want foreign intervention, so she's sort of giving a last-ditch effort towards traditional Chinese. And so she's throwing her support behind the Boxer Rebellion, which is a completely hopeless attempt at trying to expel barbarians. Now, what the Boxer Rebellion does, and what happens soon after Cixi eventually dies, she signs over, handpicks the new emperor, and that's going to be the Emperor Puyi, who's basically 3 years old when he actually attains the throne. China is thrown into so much turmoil that the exit of Cixi, that the selection of this very, very weak child emperor is probably actually going to be a benefit towards China. There's still going to be an immense amount of chaos, of disruption, of Western interference. But by finally eliminating that level of the Qing dynasty, the end of the Qing dynasty is going to mean that a new power base can eventually emerge in China. And so we're eventually going to see the creation of the Nationalist and the Communist Party, and moving China into a new direction.